that there should be a ban on consulting firms that misuse government information from receiving further government work. It almost seems, obvious that should be the case. And we've seen moves in that direction. But what I'd really like to see is an explicit policy that lays out the consequences for bad behaviour.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows. I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains big economic issues in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and today, alongside my colleagues Rod Campbell, Research Director at the Institute, and Bill Brown, Director of our Democracy and Accountability Program, we are diving back into the issue of consultancies, which continues to kick along merrily as the Senate continues its inquiry into the management and assurance of integrity by consulting services.
Accounting firm PwC is under fire for leaking confidential tax secrets from the government to companies like Apple and Google.
PwC, the Big Four consulting firm,
monetised confidential government information.
Pretty much feasting on public service.
Used information from talks with the Department of Treasury about upcoming changes to Australia's tax system to help its multinational clients avoid tax.
The federal government is now rewriting the rules of how the powerful firms are scrutinised and governed.
As the Big Four consulting firms continue to face pressure in Canberra.
This is a breach of trust.
Can't say that the circus is different if the clowns are the same.
You are a multi-billion-dollar operation for the public sector, and you come here and tell us you do not do it, and then you do it.
You've got to look at ethical practice before you issue any new contracts.
You have lied to us, have you not?
No, Senator, that's not my view.
Labor Senator Deb O'Neill and Greens Senator Barbara Pocock have been leading the charge in the Senate and the media since the initial revelations that consulting firm PwC used government secrets to advise its other clients how to avoid paying tax. Senator Deb O'Neill recently asked consultants from KPMG in the Senate inquiry whether or not they consider themselves to be a profession. Have a listen to Deb O'Neill.
Do you consider yourself a professional in your current work? Ms. Petherick.
Senator, I absolutely do, and one of the core values of McKinsey is to adhere to the highest professional standards. It's very core to how we see ourselves and what we do.
Yep. So, Mr. Moulton, do you consider yourself a professional?
I do indeed, Senator.
And Mr. Bruce, do you consider yourself a professional?
I do, Senator.
Right. Except consultancy is not a profession in the same way that law is a profession, engineering is a profession, teaching is a profession, nursing is a profession, and people have to continually adhere to publicly determined standards of behaviour and ongoing education. None of that applies to the profession of consultancy, does it?
So I'm joined here today by Rod and Bill. Rod, what's your response to that? Is consulting a profession?
Hi, Eb. It depends on your definition of profession, doesn't it? If somebody's a professional, then they just get paid to do something. But I think what Deb O'Neill's really talking about here is, the deeper sense of, is there a community of these professionals that governs the standards of that profession? And in that sense, clearly consulting is not a profession. It doesn't have a professional body that imposes any kind of discipline on its would-be members.
And Bill, what's your response there to what Deb O'Neill is putting to those KPMG consultants?
Well, my first response is thank goodness we've got a Senate that can pursue questions like this and hold to account a group that's gotten away with too much for too long. But I agree with the sentiment there. And she's quite right to draw a comparison between other groups like lawyers or doctors who are very strict with their members over, in the case of both of those professions, literally centuries that they've developed standards and expectations and rules of behaviour that people can be held to account to. Consulting, as we kind of understand it, is a much more recent phenomenon and has always been about perceptions as much as it's about reality. And this is the chickens coming home to roost there.
So, Bill, we have spoken about the issue of consultancies in the past, and I want to come back to the professional standards and things like that Deb O'Neill was kind of speaking to there. But I just want to reiterate for listeners at home why this has become such a huge issue for the Senate and the Parliament to be considering. Consulting firms, government's been relying on them a lot more in recent years, hasn't it?
That's right. So we've seen probably at this point more than a tripling in the amount of money that the government spends on consulting firms, up to in excess of $1 billion a year in recent years. That's starting to change with the Albanese government, but nonetheless, what we're seeing is a real shift to a greater dependence on consulting firms. And that leaves the public service less capable to deliver its services, to do its job, because it's been hollowed out. A lot of the work has been outsourced to these external groups. What's particularly brought this to a head is the revelation that PwC misused government information to help some of its multinational corporations potentially evade taxes. And what that brings to a head is just how large and intertwined these organizations are. They use some of the services that they provide to work their way into government departments to set themselves up to be in a good position to bid for other forms of work. They fail to respect the barriers between different groups working on different projects, so they have access to information that others don't have. What we've really seen is just how large these groups have grown and how embedded they've become in the ordinary processes of government.
The relationship between the federal government and the big four consulting firms like PricewaterhouseCoopers or PwC is worth hundreds of millions of dollars.
Rod, you've done a lot of work around the mining industry in the past. Do states like New South Wales and Queensland that engage in mining activities, do they rely on consultants do they outsource work to consultants when it comes to issues in the mining sector, in your experience?
Yeah, absolutely they do. And Bill and I spoke to the recent New South Wales parliamentary inquiry into consultants on exactly these kinds of issues, where, for example, EY or Ernst & Young were commissioned by the New South Wales government to help write their gas strategy, while they also consult to Santos, which is trying to get a big gas project started in New South Wales. There's a lot of problems and conflicts of interest with state governments, their bureaucracies, employing consultants to do various bits of work, and the potential, or at least the perceived potential, for those consultants to take a lot of that information that they get from working for governments and sell that to the private sector and the companies that are being governed by the other clients of the consultant.
And what is the New South Wales government going to consultancies for in this respect? Like, why would you go to a consultancy to ask about a gas strategy being developed by government? I can understand that gas companies would be stakeholders, but is this something really that speaks to Bill talking about the hollowing out of the public service? Is this something that you would expect a department to be able to do without relying on consultancies?
Oh, absolutely it is. And we've also got long experience in looking at economic assessment that's been commissioned by government departments or other entities that you really think should be done in-house. The fact that the New South Wales Planning Department doesn't seem to have anyone that can conduct a basic cost-benefit analysis within it is pretty shocking, really. I think the hollowing out is a real thing, but also Bill touched on Bill used an interesting word about it's the perception of expertise of the big consulting firms. And I think for a lot of public servants and people managing a process like writing a gas strategy, being able to show their supervisors, their political masters, and maybe even the public that, hey, we engaged a top-tier firm to help us with this, it helps in the sales job of that policy or other piece of work.
Rod, Bill has spoken in the past on this podcast about consultants' advice leading to bad government decision-making. But I know you've been in and around this issue, as we said, with the mining industry and its interactions with developments and proposals in that space. But is that your experience? Can you give us any examples of where consultants have kind of their reports or bad information or anything else has led to poor government decisions?
Yeah, absolutely. And they're big names. So I think a great example is Deloitte and its economics arm, Deloitte Access Economics, who wrote a study for the gas lobby group Appia, talking about just how fabulous for the Northern Territory a fracking industry would be. They wrote that report in, I think it was about 2015. And a year or two later, the Northern Territory's fracking inquiry found that report was exaggerated and unreliable. I think they're the exact words that the inquiry found. Yet despite the inquiry finding that Deloitte's work on fracking in the Northern Territory was unreliable, the federal government commissioned exactly Deloitte to write another report on the economics of fracking in the Northern Territory in 2017. And as a result, that's guided a lot of the federal government policy on subsidising fracking in the NT. So I think we've seen some terrible policy come out of a consultancy that has strong links to the gas industry. They're actually a member of the gas lobby group Appia, and that's guided government policy to the point where we're putting $1.5 billion worth of taxpayer money into projects that facilitate fracking.
Bill, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, well, during the Robodebt Royal Commission, we heard former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull give testimony about why he left Minister Alan Tudge in charge of the scheme.
Did you have much confidence Mr Tudge actually had a good grasp on what this system entailed?
I didn't regard him as being a negligent or incompetent or careless minister.
And he said, I didn't regard him as being a negligent or incompetent or careless minister, seemingly on the strength that he was a management consultant. Those words seem so magical to carry such gravitas that it led to these expectations that he'd do his job diligently and be across his brief. I think with the more recent scandals, you're unlikely to get such uncritical support of that profession, but it shows just how highly regarded it was.
Absolutely, and I think it'd be remiss of us not to talk about the nature repair market and the scandal where PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC, while wallowing in their disgrace from the tax scandal, had to walk back their assessment of the government's green Wall Street or nature offsets nature repair market, it was called. The entire federal government had placed pretty much the entire case for this pretty significant reform to federal environmental law on a report written by PwC that PwC themselves later decided, after criticism from the Australia Institute and a Senate inquiry, so yes, Bill, thank God for the Senate, they walked it back. So there's actually countless examples of where governments have succeeded or attempted to put up really some pretty poor policy on the basis of commissioned reports that, when put to even the slightest bit of scrutiny, don't stack up.
Bill, you've talked a little bit about conflicts of interest. Can you just outline the nature of some of those conflicts that we're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a conflict of interest with consulting firms that have private clients and work for government, that when they give advice to government, they may be incentivized to tailor that advice so it favors their private clients as well. You can imagine if a consulting firm's brought in to give advice on, say, a carbon offset scheme. If they have clients who provide carbon offsets, there's an obvious incentive there to recommend those clients. There's also an issue where consulting firms work for multiple arms of government. We saw that illustrated in New South Wales in the controversy over Transport for New South Wales and Treasury, both retaining KPMG to advise on a kind of spin-off of their transport system. And KPMG gave the advice that Transport for New South Wales wanted to hear to Transport for New South Wales, and the advice that Treasury wanted to hear to Treasury. Now, reasonable people can disagree on these issues, but there's a real problem when the same external expert is saying different things to different people. And that split off, it's called TAHE, Transport Holdings, has continued to cause difficulties and controversy for New South Wales.
New South Wales is now worth $20 billion less because of KPMG's advice.
But it also exposed KPMG to pressure, because if Treasury's a recurring client, Treasury can exercise influence on what you say to another department by threatening that existing relationship with Treasury. So it exposes the consulting firms quite directly to a conflict of interest concern there. And of course, another one we've identified is that if consulting firms give political donations to political parties, that opens up conflict of interest concerns when a government comprised of those political parties is making those decisions about who gets contracts after a tender. So there's all kinds of issues that emerge that need to be managed, and the evidence so far is that consulting firms are pretty limited in what they do to limit their conflicts of interest.
And if I could just jump in with sort of another way that these conflicted relationships manifest is if consulting to government, the consulting firm can gain access to information and government and public service tendencies and preferences and ideas for policy that they can then sell back to their private sector clients. You know, that was at the core of the PwC tax scandal. But Bill mentioned the carbon offset industry. I think it's astonishing that EY are a member of the carbon offset lobby group. They put out reports promoting carbon offsets, saying that every business, this is a near verbatim quote, every business should have a carbon offset strategy, and a senior EY executive was appointed to the government's inquiry into carbon offsets. So you've got the consultant participating in the government policy-making process while also selling advice on that policy-making process to private clients, all in the already dodgy world of carbon offsets. What could go wrong?
Is the public, in your view, getting value for these very large contracts with very small outputs that can be seen visibly?
Senator, we believe the public is, and we're very proud of the work that we do for Australian government.
Why is the Australian public paying you to summarise publicly available information? Isn't this something the public sector could be doing itself internally at much lower cost?
Senator, absolutely.
Rod, I want to stick with you for a second and back to this idea of economic modelling and consulting. That's one of the huge things, one of the huge services that these consulting firms do provide to companies and to government is kind of economic modelling on various things. And I want to come back to this idea that Deb O'Neill was asking about, are consultants professionals? You've been a huge critic of a lot of reports from consultants over the years, particularly when it comes to the standards for economic modelling used by consultants. What's the nature of your concerns?
Yeah, so we've talked a lot over the years that anyone can call themselves an economist. Listeners, any one of you can get out a bit of butcher's paper, write Rod's Economic Consulting, come on in and stick that on your front gate and you're absolutely fine. We've seen countless examples of where dodgy economic modelling has been submitted to public processes, where the big consultants, big and small, Deloitte, EY, Acel Allen, and lots of ones that listeners have probably never heard of, where they've been paid large amounts of money. We're talking into the hundreds of thousands of dollars for a report that, again, doesn't stand up to basic scrutiny. We've seen, for example, in the famous Rocky Hill court case over a coal mine near Gloucester, the judge described one of the economics consultants' work as, and I'm definitely quoting verbatim here, plainly wrong. And yet that plainly wrong bit of work was then taken to EY and reproduced for other clients. And the problem here is, there, as we said at the top, and as Deb O'Neill was alluding to, there's no body of professional economists that says, hey, you, stop peddling plainly wrong information. You're muddying the name of our profession. Economists wonder why they don't have much of a reputation with the public. Well, it's because there are people peddling plainly wrong analysis, and nobody ever tells them not to, except for me occasionally in a rarely read submission.
So what kind of standards do we need, Rod?
Australia Institute has drafted up a potential code of conduct for economic modellers, talking about the need to disclose conflicts of interest, basic assumptions and basic data that goes into models. It never ceases to astonish me that economic modellers can, with a straight face, say, oh, the client gave us this data, we didn't check if any of it was accurate, but if you've got a problem with the results of our modelling, take it up with the client. We didn't check that any of it was accurate. We're prepared to put our logo on this piece of work that we have no idea whether it's accurate or not. So there's clearly a lot of room for professional standards in economics around how you deal with data, how you deal with conflicts, those kinds of things that a professional body could do. And we're talking just about economists there. I think there's a lot of room for other parts of consulting to get on board with some kind of professional standards.
Bill, what about you? Is that where the Senate inquiry do you think will end up, recommending some professional standards for the industry? Or, what do you think is coming down the pipeline for the consulting industry?
I think the consultants will feel like they got off easy if that's all that the inquiry recommends. I think that's one thing they're seriously considering, standards for consultants, including economic modelers. But they're also looking at the very structure of consulting firms. A lot of these firms are set up as partnerships rather than as, say, a corporation with shareholders. So you've got a different style of running these organizations, and already with the review, Ziggy Swidowski, they've identified the way that PwC is structured as a problem and as a potential influence on why things went so wrong there. So I think the Senate is going to be asking itself, have these consulting firms grown too large? Have they become too diverse? So we've also got an issue where the big four, as they're called, PwC, KPMG, Deloitte, and EY, are not consulting firms. They're auditing and accounting and consulting firms and a bunch of other things as well. And does that set up some of these conflicts of interest issues as well? So I think the Senate's going to be asking really deep questions about the consulting industry as a whole and whether we're really served by the structure that it currently takes.
And Bill, does the Australia Institute have any other policy ideas that we've shared with the Senate or through our research?
Yeah, so the Australia Institute's put together a number of proposals about how we could address some of these problems. One of the biggest being that there should be a ban on consulting firms that misuse government information from receiving further government work. It almost seems obvious that should be the case. And we've seen moves in that direction. But what I'd really like to see is an explicit policy that lays out the consequences for bad behaviour, as well as the duration of the punishment, the proportionality, and so on. We've also talked about the role that the Senate plays, but it could do more. I'd like to see an order for the production of documents which says that if the government receives advice from consultants, it should have to publish that advice so the public can judge it on its own merits. We should also clean up the disclosures of existing contracts with consultants, require them to front up to Senate estimates, and a whole range of other things that would make consultants more responsive and responsible.
I particularly liked your recommendation, Bill, that partners should be put in the stocks outside Parliament House and rotten fruit and vegetables provided to the public.
We'll have to rely on Senate hearings as a substitute for that.
I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Rod.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Eb.
This episode was recorded on Wednesday, the 4th of October, and things may have changed since recording. You can visit australiainstitute.org.au for all our latest research and content, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. I should probably call that X now, but I just cannot get used to that. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a double N double T. Bill Brown is at Brown90, that's Brown with an E on the end. And Rod Campbell is at R_O_D_C. Our producer Jennifer Macy is at Jennifer Macy with additional editing by Emily Perkins. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Don't forget to check out our upcoming Australia Institute webinars. There's lots of exciting ones coming down the pipeline, including talking to the journal Australian Foreign Affairs about Australia's relationship with China. And we're talking to some waste experts about the size and scale of food waste in Australia and what we can do about it. You can also sign up for our newsletter, Between the Lines, which is delivered fortnightly-ish to your inbox, including an exclusive cartoon from Judy Horacek. You can do all that at australiainstitute.org.au. Thanks for listening.